Yeah, there we go. All right.
Well, and Karen, can you keep an eye on the chat and anybody who may be entering in the waiting room?
Yeah,
as well.
I will.
Thank you.
That sounds great. So yeah, we're going to be talking about ramps today, and we love to do events in person. We're excited to be doing a webinar. I think there are pros and cons. One of the advantages is that we get to it's easy for folks to join, and but of course we also love getting out into the field. And I would just say, sort of stay tuned. We do a lot of events. We'll have a lot coming up in the spring, and so there'll be plenty of chances to get outside with us in the field to do some hands-on kind of education and events and opportunities. So again, I'm Karam Shaban. I'm Rural Action's Director of Sustainable Forestry. And before we launch into our talk today on ramps, I wanted to just give a quick introduction to Rural Action for those of you who might be joining us for the first time. We're a nonprofit organization based in the Athens, Ohio area. This is our sort of central office located in the Plains, just north of Athens. And Rural Action is an asset-based community development organization. Really, the focus of all of our work is to start with the assets that exist in the communities we serve, and then to build economically and ecologically sustainable economies from those strengths and those assets. And so Rural Action works in lots of different program areas. We have sustainable agriculture program. We're the sustainable forestry program here today, giving this presentation, programs in energy solutions, watersheds, zero waste, environmental ed, lots of different programs, and we do all kinds of different work. With the forestry work that we do, we basically have been doing work around non-timber forest products. NTFPs and ramps are a great example of one of those for around 30 years at this point. We do educational events like this, often focused on a particular forest medicinal or forest understory plant that can be cultivated for income generation, for personal use. But we also have other services that we offer, things like site visits, where we'll actually come out to your forested property, we'll walk the property with you, talk about what we're seeing, listen to your goals. And at the end of that, we'll work with you to craft a non-timber forest product management plan to sort of just dial in on your interests and the opportunities that exist on your land. So that's something to keep in mind, and to get in touch with us. We'll share our contact information at the end of the presentation. But if that's something you might be interested in, we work with the Wayne National Forest and various state lands in the sort of Southeast Ohio area and beyond, and through regional partnerships, are connected to lots of different work that's happening across the Appalachian region. So that's just a little snapshot of Rural Action. If you are familiar with us, thanks for joining us again. And if you're new, definitely visit our website and check out all the great stuff that the organization's got going on. All right, let's see. Let's go to the next slide, Andrea. So as far as today, this is just a brief overview of what we're going to be talking about. Again, we're talking about ramps, one of our native understory edible plants. And we're going to cover, we're going to start with an introduction, an overview of the plant. I'm not going to assume any base level knowledge here. This is really an introduction for folks that are interested in learning more about this awesome native species. We'll touch on the history around the plant and the traditions that exist around ramps. There's a really interesting, deep kind of history there across the United States, as well as the sustainability of ramp harvest and some of the traditions that exist that involve harvesting ramps. We'll also talk about ramp life cycle development, some of the biology and ecology of the species, as well as cultivation methods. So going beyond just harvesting wild ramps actually into what we call forest farming and the opportunities that exist around cultivating ramps in your own woodlot. As part of that, we'll touch on site selection, deciding where you, what areas in your woodlot you'd like to target for growing your ramps. And then we'll talk about harvesting and marketing. So I'm going to pass it off to Andrea to get us going. So go right ahead.
Thanks, Karen. Cool. So we're just going to go over some descriptions and characteristics of ramps. So as Karen mentioned, ramps are a perennial herb. This just means that the plant comes back year after year from a rootstock that lives underground throughout the year. They're native to eastern deciduous forests of the eastern US and Canada. And they have a flavor that's similar to garlic and onions. Some people would describe it as a perfect mixture of both. There's two species native to this region, Allium tricoccum and Allium burdickii. They have a long history of harvest and use, both before European settlement, and a long history of use by First Nations people. And then one of the first plants to emerge in the spring is ramps, and they can tolerate some frost and snow. So right here in Athens, been seen ramps in the past. If you remove some of the leaf litter a little bit, you'll probably see some ramps emerging. They're the first thing to emerge. So right now is their time. Their range and distribution, it's pretty wide throughout Eastern North America, pretty widespread. Allium burdickii is mostly found in Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, Michigan. They're all very overharvested. So, either species, both of which are overharvested within their range. They can be cultivated outside of their range. However, it can be challenging because in the South, it's a little too humid, doesn't get too cold. And then out West, where it's desert, it's too dry. Ramps like a nice moist habitat. So just some physical characteristics. Ramp leaves, they're broad and flat. Typically, there are 2 to 3 leaves found per plant. They can be 7 to 12 inches long and up to 2 inches wide. However, in a nice ideal site, I've seen ramp leaves that can be sometimes 3.5 to maybe even 4.5 inches wide. The stalk is roughly 2 to 3 inches long. It can be purple or white. And the bulb is roughly 2 inches long, 1 inch wide with 5 concentric rings, which is the heart. Ramps, similarly to garlic and onions, will produce a scape, or also called a flower stalk. This is typically 6 to 10 inches tall. It grows from the heart of the bulb and produces a white cluster of flowers, which you can see in this picture down here. And then the seeds, as you can see in the picture in the bottom right, they're black and hard, and they're kind of like the size of a BB. So a couple lookalikes that you would want to be aware of. These are not ramps. Both of these are toxic. You would not want to consume either of these. The picture here on the left is lily of the valley. It's a common ornamental plant that's found in landscaping. And then the plant on the right, this is a native plant, green false hellebore. We don't have too much of this here in Athens County, but as you get down more into West Virginia, seems to be a lot more common. The biggest difference, I would say, is, if you see either of these growing in the woods and you think it's a ramp, you want to do the smell test, break off a little piece of the leaf. Neither of these species right here will have any sort of onion or garlic or ramp smell. They won't have a similar smell at all. So that's probably the biggest dead giveaway. Second is these flowers of the lily of the valley. They look quite a bit different than the ramp flower. And then, the green false hellebore seems to have multiple leaves, coming from that main stalk, whereas ramps just have 2 to 3 leaves coming out of the base of the plant. So just a couple, plants to look out for. They're not, I would say that lily of the valley it's not a super common garden escape, as we would say, because it's cultivated. So sometimes plants, when they're cultivated in a garden, they can escape. I would say it's not super common, but just, be on the lookout. These are not ramps, and these are both toxic plants. So just some nutritional and medicinal properties. Ramps are pretty high in vitamin C. They actually have more vitamin C than oranges. They're high in vitamin A, lutein, folic acid, selenium, and magnesium. And they have some medicinal properties as well. So First Nations peoples would use ramps for colds, for croup. Juices were extracted from the leaves and bulbs and heated up to treat earaches, and they're also used as a spring tonic. Ramps are in the same family as garlic, so they have a lot of the same constituents. They contain thiosulfonates, and a really highly studied thiosulfonate would be allicin, which is found in garlic. It's that constituent that you smell when you crush up garlic and you leave it on the counter and you start to smell it. That's the allicin. And that's one of the main medicinal constituents that's found in garlic and is also found in ramps, but to a lesser extent. It's not in as high of a concentration in ramps as it is in garlic. So some of the history, culture, and sustainability. So ramps have a long history of use in Appalachia, tradition of ramp harvesting. Again, it's the first green that emerges in the spring. So they have just a vast history of use and culture among peoples from this area. They also present an income opportunity for folks who are either growing them and selling them or wild harvesting them. There's multiple ramp festivals and dinners throughout the Appalachian region. And it's a cultural and community tradition, and even in some areas, a fundraising service for local organizations. We actually sell ramp bulb planting stock to community members as a way to fund some of the projects that Karen mentioned in the introduction that we do, like site visits and just working with landowners to promote sustainable forestry options on their land. So this is a prime example of rural action using ramps for fundraising. Oops, sorry everyone, getting ahead of myself. Most ramps on the market are wild harvested, and it's estimated that around 10 million plants per year are harvested. So these are just a couple examples of some ramp festivals. This guy looks like he's eating raw ramps. That's a staple of some ramp festivals. Festivals found throughout West Virginia, in Tennessee, the Cosby Ramp Festival in Tennessee, upwards of sometimes 30,000 visitors, and has been taking place since 1954. So really culturally significant within that region. The Flag Pond Ramp Festival in Tennessee, Ramp It Up Festival in Cherokee, North Carolina, and I would say probably over 25 ramp festivals alone in West Virginia. So really, really significant plant within this region. So ramp festivals are great, but it does kind of put pressure on wild populations. So they're attended by tens of thousands of people. Again, maybe 50 festivals in the Eastern US annually. And so ramp festivals are one way that's putting pressure on wild populations, but also one of the other things that's putting pressure on wild populations is the fact that high-end restaurants are purchasing ramps to sell as food. Lots of restaurants in Chicago, New York City, Seattle, DC, etc. So people are going out, in the woods in Appalachia, and digging up these ramps and selling them to high-end restaurants in the cities. One business in West Virginia selling 25,000 pounds of ramps annually across the country. That's 2.5 million plants. It's almost hard to believe that that's even sustainable because it's not. So yeah, an estimated 10 to 15 million plants are harvested each year.
All right, so we're going to touch a bit on ramp habitat and growing sites. So when you're thinking about, whether you're interested in, doing some wild harvesting yourself, you want to see if you have ramps on your property, or you're interested in cultivating ramps. This is going to be kind of the critical information you'll need for both of those activities. So, like we've mentioned, ramps are, they're an understory perennial herb. And so you're going to find them under a forest canopy. And you're ideally looking for a deciduous forest, meaning, portions of your woods that are losing their leaves in the winter. And, a big part of that is, and we'll touch on this, but the ramps are really utilizing that early spring sunlight when the trees haven't leafed back out as their time to photosynthesize and gather energy. In particular, on your deciduous forest sites, you're looking for north and east facing aspects and generally on a slope. And this is true of a lot of the understory herbs that we work with. These portions of woods in the northern hemisphere, the north and east facing aspects, are the cooler aspects. They get the morning sunlight. And so that cool morning sunlight leads to a whole host of site conditions, such as increased soil moisture because of just less ambient heat coming from sunlight that create conditions that are conducive to really the rich, they call them mesic, meaning just like water loving understory diversity that you'll see in these sites. And that includes species like ramps, which really do love moisture. So you're looking for a deciduous forest, a north to east facing aspect, and you want a closed forest canopy, a mature forest canopy. And so you're seeing this number 50 to 80% shade coverage. That's kind of an ideal range for ramps. There's been some recent research done. It's really interesting, just kind of testing ramps' ability to tolerate sunlight. And they've actually found in these studies that ramps can actually be grown in open sun, but they won't reproduce. And in their natural environments where they're most competitive, it's these shaded forest sites. And so if you're going out looking for wild ramps, avoid the open fields. You're going to find them in these shady forested conditions. They really do like moisture. That's kind of a critical piece for a lot of these understory herbs, but especially ramps. That being said, you're not going to find them in standing water. So you want sites that are moist, but not wet. And this is generally going to be on well-drained soils, not clay soils. It's another reason why you'll often find ramps on hillsides, because just the orientation of the hillside allows water to run through it and pass through it, so you're not getting standing water. And as far as the nutrient profile of the soil, they generally like what sometimes are called sweeter soils or more fertile, and calcium in particular seems like a really important nutrient that ramps respond to. And so an ideal site would have high levels of soil calcium in the 2,500 to 5,000 pounds per acre range. Yeah, and generally slightly acidic sites with a pH in that sort of 5 to 5.5 range is best. And so when you're out hunting for that ramp habitat or looking for a site where you might want to begin cultivating ramps, you're going to look for those things: deciduous forest canopy. You're going to look for northeast facing slopes. But to really kind of dig in even further, a great way to start is to look for what we call indicator species, which are giving you a sense that you're on a good site for ramps. And so some of the tree species that you're going to be looking for, the big one is sugar maple. And sugar maple is, it's thought to actually exist in almost like a symbiotic relationship with herbs such as ramps and ginseng. It has this ability to concentrate calcium in the leaves, and then when the leaf litter is deposited onto the forest floor, you get this surge of calcium right into that leaf litter layer. And so sugar maple is a big one for ramps. But a lot of the other species that you'll see in association with sugar maple are things like tulip poplar, beech trees, basswood, which is another species that does that kind of calcium concentration in the leaves, birch, pawpaw. These are all tree species that like these mesic sites, more with higher levels of soil moisture and soil nutrients. If you look down underneath the trees, down to the forest floor, you'll often find ramps living with a whole host of companion understory herbs. And these are things like trillium, wild American ginseng, bloodroot, black and blue cohosh. And then there's a variety of ferns that you'll find on these mesic sites as well. So if you're interested in more, we have resources on all this stuff that we can share out. But here is just a short list of some of the things you'll be looking for in your ramp habitat. So here's just a snapshot of a site that if you walked into, you might think, well, this could be a good site. And I'm seeing a couple things here. Obviously, we're seeing a creek. And so what's that telling you? Well, it's telling you that you've probably got good moisture on this site. And you can see you've got slopes, a sloped habitat on each side of this creek. And so again, the advantage of a slope is that water is moving through it, meaning that there's high moisture availability, but water is not pooling. And so you're not getting that, those really swampy conditions that are not going to be conducive for ramp growth. And so The slopes are and the water, those are both great signs. You can see that this is largely, this seems to be a photo taken in spring. So it's a deciduous forest canopy. That's definitely what you're looking for. We don't know what we were facing here, but presumably, one of these sides of the hill are going to be north and or east facing. And so you'd want to kind of dial in on that side. Although ramps will do well in microsites that sometimes exist like low on a slope here. So if it's south or west facing, but it's down by the creek, there might be higher levels of moisture. There's less sun getting down there at the very bottom of like a hollow. So it's always good to do a couple test plantings in sites that might work. So your ramp sites, they probably will look something like this. So another key component to your good ramp habitat is the leaf litter. This is pretty critical especially for seed germination and survival of ramps. But I mean, this is sort of like nature's mulch. And that leaf litter is providing everything from organic matter, nutrients like the calcium I mentioned. You can see some maple leaves here in this picture. It's also holding moisture in underneath that level, that leaf litter, and providing insulation too from temperature fluctuations for the seed, as well as a degree of weed suppression and competition suppression for those plants. And so this leaf litter it's key for germination and survival of ramp seed. And if you say you were interested in growing ramps outside of a forest setting, you might be able to purchase it, or you could take some out of your own woodlot. Actually, taking some of this leaf litter out and using it as a mulch. One thing I'll just mention, we covered the companion tree species that you'll find in association with ramps, things like sugar maple, tulip poplar, basswood, and after we're done here, if you have access to some woods, it might be interesting. I'd say, get out into the woods and just take a look at the leaf litter on the ground. There's still leaf litter on the ground. The species that we mentioned here, their leaf litter, it decomposes really easily in comparison to what you'll find on your drier sites, your oak species, your hickory. Those leaves tend to decompose a lot slower. They're tougher, they're thicker. And so part of what's going on here with the leaf litter on these mesic sites is that they're decomposing easily and actually creating good conditions for those seeds to germinate and push up through the leaf litter. So a couple just, quick notes, and hopefully by the end of this presentation, you won't do these things, but we're just going to spell them out. A couple things you don't ever want to do if you want to grow ramps. You do not want to plant them under evergreens, your conifers. That's for a couple reasons. One, you'll often find conifers on your drier sites, depending on which species we're talking about. And so that's part of it. And drier sites just aren't going to be great for growing ramps. A lot of conifers have their needles actually will like acidify the soil and change the soil conditions to the point that you just don't see much growing underneath them. And so this looks like it's a pine plantation in this picture. But also if you look at even on like a moist site, if you have a hemlock tree growing, take a look under that hemlock tree and you'll notice that really nothing grows underneath that hemlock. And so as a rule of thumb, just avoid planting underneath evergreens. You also don't want to plant in a windswept location. And ramp seeds, they're tiny. They're kind of like little black BBs, and we'll have some pictures of them later. But they could just blow right away. And you need that good contact with the soil surface for them to germinate and grow. Similarly, you don't want to plant those seeds in direct sun. Like I mentioned, ramps might be able to grow in direct sunlight, but the seeds aren't able to germinate. They don't reproduce. They really want that shade, moisture, and contact with the soil. That's critical. And same with planting in a really hot location, hot, dry. These things tend to go together. You want shade, you want moisture, and so just as a rule of thumb, do not do these things.
I was muted. Sorry about that. Going to go over the ecology, growth, and life cycle of ramps. So ramp growth and development, like we mentioned, they're the first thing to emerge in the spring. So they're beginning to emerge right now, emerging in March, and they grow pretty rapidly through April. Their leaves can honestly grow up to a ½ inch per day, which is really fast. So they really utilize April to grow. Their bulb size will increase throughout the growing season, and it's going to increase so it can store energy for the winter months so it can survive underground because it is a perennial herb. They reach harvestable size by mid-April. That's when the bulb is typically the biggest. And they also have peak flavor and tenderness during that time. Fully developed right at the beginning of May and kind of tend to dampen off after that. They'll start to turn yellow and die back in June, but I've seen some locations where if it's kind of a drier year or they're getting a lot of sun, those leaves will actually turn yellow and die back in mid to late May. So again, mid-April to late April at the latest, I would say is definitely peak flavor, tenderness, harvestable size. And then the flower stalk will emerge from the bulb. They bloom around July and August. So ramps flower after the leaves leaf out and then the leaves die back. So they flower during this time to take advantage of a time when not a lot of other plants are blooming in the forest. So it's really advantageous because they're able to be pollinated by bees, ants, and insects. They are self-fertile as well, but being able to be pollinated increases genetic diversity throughout populations, and roughly takes 6 to 7 years before a ramp will flower. So if a seed germinates, it'll take that plant 6 to 7 years before it can flower. The green seed pods, they'll develop through August into what's called a 3-lobed seed pod, hence the name trichoca. They're pretty sensitive to drought, molding, and spoilage. So if we have a really, really dry year, seeds don't tend to develop as well, and they can mold easily and they can spoil. They ripen in September through October. And there's a picture right down there. Those are the black BBs like we've been talking about. The green husks will open and then expose the shiny black seeds, and there's roughly 12 to 24 seeds per plant. So the seed biology, the seeds are actually underdeveloped when they are at the ripe stage of harvesting. They'll need an 18-month stratification period, and basically all that means is they'll need a cold period followed by a warm period followed by another cold period and then a warm period to germinate. A lot of our native understory plants require the same stratification period, so ramps are pretty similar to them in that regard. If you are harvesting seeds, you'll want to store them in a cool, dark place or sow them immediately. I would probably, if you're collecting ramp seeds, I would probably sow them immediately because that's how nature does it. When the seeds are ripe on the plant, they fall to the ground. So again, you can collect them and store them. If you do want to do that, you just want to keep them in a cool, dark place and just make sure that you really follow that accordingly. So dispersal, they'll naturally disperse their seeds. They'll either fall to the ground or they will be transferred by birds or rodents or other critters in the woods that are running around, and humans will disperse their seeds as well. So again, that stratification and germination, you need the 18-month stratification period. Again, the seasonal fluctuation of cold, warm, cold, and warm. And again, it's best to sow directly because that's how nature does it. That's the most natural way. When you start to store things in the fridge, and sometimes you'll forget about it and then you won't plant them in time and then your seed becomes non-viable. So if you're collecting ramps, probably best to just plant the ramp seeds right then and there. So growth during the winter months. So the bulb is constantly changing throughout the year. So in November and December, that bulb is underground still, and it's going to shed its outer layers and it's going to be pretty small. If you were to dig up a ramp bulb in November and December, it's going to be a lot smaller than it would be if you were to harvest that ramp bulb in, say, mid-April when the bulb is at peak large size. So the flower stalk, again, that comes from the bulb, it moves to the outer ring of the bulb. In January, the new heart is developing at the center, so it grows a third in size. So in January, the bulb is roughly a third bigger than it was in November or December. And then in February, it's getting ready to sprout because ramps emerge in March. So it's roughly 2/3 bigger than it was in January. So again, the ramp bulb is changing in size throughout the season. And then vegetative reproduction. So ramp bulbs have two ways of reproducing. One is via seed, like we've talked about, and then the other is bulb division. So this is mainly what contributes to population growth, which is why if you're out in a ramp patch, sometimes you'll see a huge cluster of ramps that it's almost like there's too many in one little cluster. This is because they're dividing via bulbs. This is evolutionarily advantageous because it gives the ramp plant two methods of reproduction as opposed to just being able to reproduce by seed.
All right, well, we're going to move into talking about cultivating ramps. So, there is probably the most common way that people engage with ramps is to harvest them out of wild populations, like we've seen in some of the pictures in this slideshow so far. Rural Action, we work a lot with folks that are interested in actively cultivating plants in their forest understories. We call this forest farming. And ramps are a great candidate species for forest farming operations in woodlots in this part of the country. And so there's a real opportunity to cultivate ramps, but to this point, there are relatively few established growers that are really taking, this model of forest farming ramps and running with it. There are growers in states kind of across the region. Ramps, the native range is, pretty large, and so we've got growers in West Virginia, North Carolina, up into New York, in Pennsylvania as well, and so there's a real opportunity here. Like we kind of mentioned, there are great marketing opportunities. We'll talk a bit more about this, but if you were interested in starting an operation based around ramp cultivation, great opportunities to sell that crop to local restaurants. Like we sort of mentioned, they're really popular, and it's been honestly, they've just been growing in popularity over the last decade or so in these really kind of fancy upscale restaurants that are doing, local food and seasonal foods. I have a friend who, for a while, was working as like a professional forager, and he actually, for a time, worked in Seattle and was foraging ramps and for upscale restaurants in Seattle. So it's interesting. It really is. It's turned into quite the fad, the food fad right now. There are some issues when it comes to cultivating ramps around planting stock supply. And so I know Andrea mentioned earlier that Rural Action, we sell planting stock for a couple species, American Ginseng, also ramps, and we're a little limited in terms of the supply that we're able to get to resell. And I think we ran through our planting stock in less than a week in terms of just the supply of what we had. And so that's something that us and some of our partners are working on, trying to develop more reliable supplies of planting stock material. But there are also great ways, if you're interested in starting like a little business around growing ramps, to add value to your products by doing some value added things, whether that's, people pickle ramps, and we'll get into some of that in a little bit, but lots of ways to add some value, as well as to sell direct to, retailers, direct to a restaurant. And so if you can get savvy with your marketing, there are some really great ways to make a fairly substantial side income from growing ramps. You can, and it should be, and I'm going to mention this in a minute here, but cultivating ramps and then working with wild populations of ramps are not mutually exclusive activities. And so this bullet, use available resources, in a lot of cases, folks will have a big ramp patch already in existence on their property. And so you may choose to do some wild harvesting from that population at the same time that you may do some active cultivation in another part of your forest, or maybe you're doing a little bit of both. Maybe you're harvesting at the same time that you're replanting seeds. And so that's kind of like using a framework of managing your wild patches sustainably, and it's not mutually exclusive with cultivating. So when we get into the practice of cultivating ramps, there's a couple different ways you can approach this. So you can grow ramps in your forest And, we talked about site selection, like those sites where you might find wild ramps. It's a great place to start your own population from seed or maybe transplanting bulbs. And in those forested sites, those tend to have the least, in terms of labor, in terms of costs, in terms of management, they tend to be the easiest sites because that's the natural environment where ramps want to grow anyway. And so if you were to purchase some ramp seed and sow it into, some great ramp habitat, it's very possible that that's the last thing you would need to do until you wanted to harvest those ramps. And so we recommend for a lot of folks this approach, forest farming. It's sort of the easiest way to go. You would want to make sure that you're picking the right site. And we talked about what that looked like: north and east facing slopes. You're looking for your sugar maples, poplars, beech, and your associated companion herb species. So if you don't have the right site, it's your forest farming approach is not going to work. And so that's a critical piece. But if you can get that right, it's a great way to go. You can plant ramp seed. You can also transplant ramp bulbs. And Rural Action has sold both, and we've done workshops, showcasing both methods. Ramp bulbs transplant pretty well compared to some other species that you might transplant. Ramp seed has sometimes the germination rates can sometimes be a little iffy. That's just that's part of the reason that the species produces so much seed. It's like just throwing them all out there and sort of seeing what happens. But both are really great ways. And we actually recommend people, maybe do both in the same site. As far as the tools that you need, if you're interested in doing some forest farming, you could do a lot of this by hand. So you don't need tools. So you don't need to worry about that as a barrier. But things like a leaf rake, a hard steel rake to kind of scarify the soil and can be helpful. Pruners in case you need to prune back any bushes, shrubs, or things that are going to just impede your ability to access the site. And then like a mattock or a hand mattock for actually harvesting those ramps, that can be helpful too. I just wanted to point out this picture below. So you've got the forest farm site above, and the site below, they're actually cultivating ramps in a raised bed. That's another option. Like I said, you could even do that in full sun if you transplanted ramps. It's just more work, and if they're not going to reproduce, you just want to think about your goals and what you're hoping to get out of your planting. So I know we've mentioned this term a few times, forest farming, and what I want to point out with this slide here is that forest farming and all of these activities exist kind of you could think of it as a continuum of production. And so on the one end of the continuum, you've got this wild harvesting, which is, like we mentioned, just tending to your existing populations, working with what's already there. Then you get we get into what's called wild simulated production. And, this is working with a forested environment and maybe just introducing ramps, whether or not they already exist on the property, taking some new planting stock, introducing ramps into that forest environment and letting them grow as if they were just a wild plant, hence wild simulated. Another type of production is what gets called woods grown production. And in this picture, you can see these aren't ramps. This is ginseng in a forest understory, but it's almost a monoculture of ginseng. And so ginseng would never do this naturally. Ramps are kind of interesting because sometimes you'll see ramp patches that seem like they literally are carpeting the entire forest floor. If from a forest farming perspective, a woods grown approach to forest farming would mean that you are actually modifying the conditions of that forest site to really suit that kind of monoculture approach. And that might mean like removing competing plants. It might mean that you're actually going through and tilling up the soil a little bit to just give those plants more room to grow more easily. So it's a little more intensive than just throwing seeds into the woods and letting them grow. And for some folks, that are interested in higher levels of production, that's the way they'll go. And there's one more type. This is just for your reference. So this is field cultivation. Again, this is ginseng. I put these in here for reference. You can see that these plants are being grown under artificial shade cloth. So rather than a forest canopy, they're using this shade cloth to create those shade conditions. They're also grown in these raised beds. This is really a commercial scale, and you don't really see this for ramps. But just to kind of give you a sense, when it comes to propagating and cultivating forest herbs, there's a variety of ways that you can approach this, and you really want to think about like what is going to fit with my goals and the resources I have available to me. So when it comes to ramps, like we mentioned, in many cases, folks actually have large existing wild populations already, and I think so. In that case, we're really probably thinking most about wild harvesting and then stewardship practices to maintain that population. So you're not just drawing on that population as you harvest and causing it to decline slowly over time. If you want to cultivate ramps yourself, we really recommend wild simulated production as probably the most appropriate way for most landowners to introduce ramps to their property. And so this is really simple. Like I said, it could be as simple as getting some ramp seed and taking a handful and chucking it into the woods and having them land right on top of that leaf litter. And that's kind of what happens naturally. I mean, the plants just drop those leaves right on top of the leaf litter. But if you want to increase your chance of success with those plantings, you can take an approach like this guy here. You basically can take some like a leaf rake, start with the leaf rake, move laterally across that planting area, rake back the leaf litter. You can take that hard rake and kind of go over the surface of the soil with a hard rake they call that scarifying the soil. That just makes it so that when you broadcast the seeds onto that spot, you're increasing the surface area between the seed and the soil. It improves your chances of having good germination. And then once you've done that, you just cover that area back up with the leaf litter. You can walk across it to just kind of tamp things down. And then this is typically done in the fall when the leaf litter is down on the ground, and you just kind of walk away, and the seeds are going to go through their natural stratification process. And after 18 months, will germinate. And this is a fall planting is great if you're planting seed. If you're planting ramp bulbs, the best time to do that is once, just like early spring, late February, March, once the soil is starting to thaw out. And you can do these two activities on the same site. Little insurance plan for your plantings. So planting bulbs, we covered some of this. Spring is the best time to do it. You can get your ramp bulbs in February, March. Same process in some ways, right? You just want to rake back that leaf litter. In this case, you're actually going to be taking that bulb and sticking it into the ground. So you want to just be, whether you can use a stick to do that. You can use hand tools like a mattock, and just want to dig a little space, maybe roughly 3 inches deep, but really you want to put that ramp bulb in the ground so that just the tip of that bulb is poking above the soil surface. That's actually how the plants overwinter. And that's also just, they're going to then be able to shoot their leaf up from there and get going. So spacing, you can think maybe 6 to 8 inches. Some people plant even further apart. As you've seen in some of these pictures, ramps, especially because they have the ability to asexually reproduce and clone themselves, they can, over time, they can become really dense, and you'll see these really dense populations where the bulb is essentially just propagated itself and can form they call it a clump. And so if you want to start with wide spacing, it'll give those plants room to kind of grow toward one another. Toss the leaves back on in the spring, and then by March, you'll see them start growing basically immediately. So we talked about this. I'm not going to spend much more time on it. Fall is the most common time to plant seeds. You could do it in the early spring too, but we sort of talked about it. You could just broadcast them or use that wild simulated technique that we described. We're raking back the leaf litter, broadcasting the seeds, and then covering those plantings back up. So something that you might want to think about, and this is true whether you're, doing a wild harvest and working with an existing population, or starting a population and thinking about, sustainable management over time. Um, Ramps are slow growing plants, like we touched on. It takes, from seed, it takes a plant 7 years, 7 growing seasons to reach reproductive maturity, which is also the timing for generally when we say is it's good to harvest, is you really only want to harvest a reproductive plant. Something I don't know that we mentioned, but a way to tell if a plant is reproductive is, so a seedling will just put up one little leaf, and the seedlings are very kind of small, skinny, almost looks like a little blade of grass. In the second and third year, that will, that leaf will become broader and resemble what we recognize to be that sort of classic ramp leaf shape, a little wider. But once that plant is reproductive, it'll actually put up a second leaf. And so if you see two leaves coming from the same plant, right next to each other, that's a sign that that plant is reproductive and is at a point where it would, it's appropriate to harvest it. But like I said, they're slow growing. And so when you're thinking about sustainability, you really want to be cautious in terms of the amount of a given population that you're going to harvest. And so there's a lot of research on this, and it's a topic of a lot of debate in the ramp world. So a number you'll commonly see is this 10%. You only want to harvest 10% of a population. And that actually, I think, comes from a study from 2003 that came up with this number that you want to harvest 10% of a population only every 10 years. And so that's a pretty cautious approach. There have been some other approaches where rather than thinking about 10% of a whole population, you actually want to just think about harvesting to a certain density. And so, some of those spacing numbers we saw, just like in any given area within your ramp patch, harvesting that down to, like a certain density. And there's different ways to approach it, but really you just want to, when you're thinking about sustainability, keep an eye on your population over time and just notice, with the level that I'm harvesting, is this population growing? Is it shrinking? Staying the same? A good way in a given ramp patch to just ensure that you're approaching things sustainably is to go through in the fall and collect the seeds and then go and actively replant them. Like I said, they'll just drop right off, and you can see these flowers, and those are going to mature into seeds. They'll just drop and fall right under the leaf litter. And so if you actively go and rake back the leaf litter, scarify the soil, broadcast the seeds, you can really improve your chances of successful germination. And if you have that wild patch, that resource is your best friend. Planting stock can be costly. It depends on where you get it, but you might spend $5.50 seeds if you can find them. And when you've got a bunch of seed pods on your property already, it's can be a little bit of work to go and harvest those seeds, but can be well worth it to save you the money and also just ensure that that population is going to grow over time. So we'll just mention, ramps are pretty good when it comes to disease and are generally pretty tolerant. But a couple of things just to mention: deer don't really bother ramps too much. It's probably that strong flavor that maybe only humans really enjoy. Honestly, I think it works as a deterrent to deer. But you will see some deer browse if there's nothing else for them to eat. Turkeys can browse on young leaves. Turkey scratch can kill seedlings. So, that's something you just want to keep tabs on if you've got a lot of wild turkeys kind of on your property. This septoria leaf spot, it's a cosmetic thing. You'll see this sometimes. And if you want to think about this, if you're, for example, selling your ramps to a restaurant, they're probably not going to want, leaves with just visual blemishes or anything on them. But it's not that common. Ramps are pretty tolerant, especially if you get out there earlier in the season. It's when you get later into the season, you'll start to see some of the discoloration and kind of fungal things going on. But Um, Ramps are pretty good. A bigger issue that they do suffer from is this, it's in quotes here, clump death. But we talked about how ramps can reproduce asexually. And when they do that, essentially that new bulb is immediately next to the bulb that it separated off from. And so you get this clumping like you see in this picture here. And this is not necessarily a huge problem, but what can happen is that can stress the plant out. It can also create conditions where like moisture can pool between the bulbs, and so you can get some fungal die off. A great way to deal with this is to go in and harvest a portion of those ramps and free up some space. And then over time, they're just gonna continue to vegetatively reproduce and fill in the space. And so I would target those clumps when you're thinking about harvesting. And always good to just inspect any ramp patch that you have for signs of disease or mortality. And again, just monitoring that population and seeing how it's doing on a regular basis. Yeah, and then maybe the biggest pest is humans, poachers. And this is a problem with a lot of the herbs that we grow, especially ginseng, but ramps aren't immune. You'll see this, I think that ramps are especially vulnerable on public lands, national and state forest land, near trails. We've got some amazing, thinking about the Wayne National Forest, we've got some amazing ramp populations, but right near a trail, people are often will come by and use that as easy access to do a ramp harvest. So something one you keep about, especially on your own property, you just want to be aware. Are there people moving through my property? Am I noticing harvesting happening? So something to keep in mind. All right, so we'll talk a little bit about harvesting ramps here. So when you're thinking about harvesting, we mentioned they're spring ephemeral. And so ramps are, maybe emerging in March, and, they're basically gone, at least in Ohio. This obviously depends on where you are in their range, but they're gone by June in many cases. And so when you're thinking about timing your harvest, the plant changes throughout the season in a number of ways. And so early on in the season, that plant is sending all of the energy that it's got stored up in that bulb that overwinters, and it's sending it up into the leaf. And so early in the season, in that sort of like late March, April period of time, that's when the leaves have the most flavor. They're that dark, vibrant green, and all the energy in the plant and the active compounds that give them their great flavor are up there in the leaves. That starts to change throughout the course of the season. Once you get into May, you'll notice in this picture, these ramps have a really like thick bulb down at the bottom. Earlier in the season, that bulb is it's a lot thinner, and so that's actually the plant throughout that growing season taking that photosynthate energy from the sun and pulling it down into that bulb, which is really like it's a storage organ. It's holding the energy that plant is collecting. So over time that'll grow, and the ramp will start to lose its that distinctive flavor. They just become less flavorful. So you want to think about timing when you're harvesting, and earlier in the season, your ramps will be more flavorful. Like I mentioned, you want to target those clumps. That's a great place. You're actually you're able to harvest ramps at the same time that you're helping to ensure the health of that population over time by giving it some growing space. If you're transplanting bulbs that are already mature, or close to being mature, you can think about harvesting after 4 to 6 years. If you're harvesting from a population that you sowed as seed, it's going to take about 7 years before those plants are mature and at a point where you can harvest. You can harvest. So if you're selling to market, restaurants, for example, they're likely going to want the entire plant, like you see pictured here. with the bulb intact and everything. This obviously kills the plant. Another approach that is a great alternative is to just do a leaf harvest. Like I said, especially earlier in the season, the leaves have, great flavor. In fact, all the flavors up there in the leaf. And so if you go through and on a mature plant that has 2 leaves and you just cut 1 leaf, that is a great alternative. And then that plant is going to put leaves up the following year as well. And so it's a sustainable way to still get to do some harvest and keep that plant in the ground. Just a couple tips. You want to think about timing that harvest in the morning to avoid direct sunlight, which is just gonna, once that plant's out of the ground, it's gonna start degrading pretty quickly. And so you want to avoid heat and wilt and maybe process that plant as quickly as you can. You want to hold the stalk when you're harvesting. You don't want to squeeze too tightly, bruise the leaves, be gentle. This is where tools can be helpful as a way to just kind of be gentler on the plants. And you want to be careful too when you're going in. You don't want to damage the bulbs. So if you got a tool or whatever it is, give yourself a wide berth around the area you're trying to harvest. This can be hard in really dense populations, but just be careful. Don't want to damage the bulbs. And this is just like I was mentioning, the way that the ramp changes shape throughout the course of the season. This is just kind of an interesting graph that shows the relationship between the time of year and the size of ramps, and therefore how many ramps it takes to make a pound. And so you'll see, like, if you get on social media, there are a lot of there are Facebook groups devoted to ramp harvesting. And so there are some people out in February that are harvesting ramps before they've even put a leaf up and selling them. And in that early season, you're selling ramps, they get sold by the pound. And so thinking about sustainability, if you're harvesting early in that season, it can take 3 or 4 times as many plants to constitute 1 pound than if you wait later into the season. And so if you're thinking about sustainability of the plant, and you're thinking about, your profit per unit of effort or whatever you want to think about, it's best to wait till, mid-April and beyond to let that plant really put on some mass. So, and if you wait later into April, May, we're looking at about 80 plants per pound. Quick notes on washing, post-harvest handling. So if you're selling to market, you want a clean, marketable product. And so you can see this cool little wire washing rack. That's a great way to approach this. You could just use a sink, whatever it is. You just want to be careful, if you're doing it by hand. Again, you don't want to damage the plants. Same deal if you're using a hose. You don't want to, blast them so hard that you actually damage the plants. And then this is kind of a big one, because you'll see people approach this lots of different ways, but you want to trim off those fibrous roots, but you don't want to remove them completely. And so sometimes you'll see people actually cut above the fibrous roots and cut off part of the bulb. You don't want to do that. You can leave those intact and then let the person that buys them from you decide how they want to deal with the roots. So, and it is important to keep them cold. The sooner you can get them into a refrigerator, just the longer they're going to stay fresh and last without wilting. And that's just going to really help you retain the value of your effort.
So the last thing we're going to talk about is marketing ramps. So generally speaking, there's roughly 75 plants per pound, give or take, again, when you're harvesting the ramp. But the market price is roughly $7 to $28 a pound. You could sell your ramps at farmers markets, roadside stand, kind of like what's pictured here, ramp festivals, like we've talked about, dinners, and directly to restaurants. And urban markets, there's kind of an up and coming growing demand for ramps in urban markets, which would require shipping. So you'd have to take that into consideration, but definitely some options there for marketing your ramps. You could also make ramp products. You can utilize the leaves, like Karen mentioned. You can utilize the whole plant. You can utilize the bulbs and seeds as planting stock, or you can create value-added products like ramp pasta, crackers, pesto, cheeses, ramp gravy mix, and even pickled ramps. There's a few local producers, Integration Acres, Chris Schmiel, he creates ramp products. He makes pasta, makes some crackers, makes some spreads and things like that. So really the opportunities are endless. And considering the fact that the ramp has a flavor that's similar to garlic and onion, if you think of all the ways that you could use garlic and onions, you can implement ramps in that same way. So there is price competition from wild harvesters. You know, a lot of times folks will be wanting wild ramps as opposed to forest grown ramps. There's some debate on that. Some folks say that the genetics are different, the sizes are different, but generally speaking, if you're growing your own ramps, you can get a good market price for those. And there is an opportunity to create sustainable brands. So if you are growing ramps, you can market your ramps in a way that is geared towards taking pressure off of wild population. You can say things like sustainably produced. That's a great selling point. Or United Plant Savers has a program called FGV, which is forest grown verified, which basically they would come out to your property, say that, yes, you're sustainably growing these plants and you can get an FGV certification, which would also be a great selling point for your ramps. And you can do this for other forest grown products as well, like ginseng, golden seal, and black cohosh. And then always educate the consumer. You know, a lot of times folks might not know what a ramp is. So education is always key. And then lastly, just some resources for growers here. North Carolina State University has a lot of great references. Having Your Ramps and Eating Them Too by Glenn Facemeyer Jr. It's an excellent print. And then the Scott Pearsons and Janine Davis book, Growing and Marketing Ginseng, Golden Seal, and Other Woodland Medicinals. If you're really interested in getting into forest farming, I highly recommend the Scott Pearsons and Janine Davis book, The Growing and Marketing Ginseng, Golden Seal, and Other Woodland Medicinals. It's a really great reference. And then if you have any questions, comments, or assistance, our phone number is listed here. Karam's email, my email, and our AmeriCorps member Loranda's email is listed here. And we also have our Rural Action website, which has quite a few references on it as well. And yeah, don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions or need anything in terms of NTFP assistance or sustainable forestry assistance, or even if you're interested in a site visit. And then last, here's just a picture of some wild ramps in a grocery store next to some fiddleheads, which are young fern leaves harvested as they're unfurling, next to some purple artichokes, some green beans, and broccoli. So yes, ramps have a place in the world.
All right, well, I am not seeing any questions in the chat. If you have any, that'll be the time to throw them in there. But you also have our contact information. We're happy to answer questions at any time. And like we kind of mentioned, stay plugged in with Rural Action and what we're doing. You know, our forestry program is going to have, we've got a lot going on in the spring. We'll be doing site visits and other things, but always have events coming down the pike. So, all right, so let's see. We got one question that I'm seeing here. Best time to transplant bulbs, the earliest in spring that you can identify them to dig. Yeah, that might be a way of thinking about it. So like when the ramp bulbs that we sell, so over winter, the ramps will actually, if you dig back the leaf litter and you know you've got ramps somewhere, you can see like that little ramp bulb has just got this little white bulb that's sticking above the surface. Sometimes you'll hear that called, people harvest them, they call them bullet ramps. Not a good thing. Don't harvest ramps at that time. And what you'll start to see is that they'll start to put a leaf out early on. You might start to see it poking through the leaf litter. And if you buy bulbs to transplant, that's the state that they're in. That leaf is just starting to emerge. And so, yes. And let's see. Follow-up question. Assuming mature ramps with larger bulbs don't transplant as well. You know, in my experience, ramp bulbs just generally do quite well being transplanted, and I think it has to do with I think it's partly them being an allium. I think they just are pretty tolerant, and I think it has to do with that bulb functioning as a storage organ. It just holds on to energy pretty well, so they're pretty good at withstanding shock or other things. Rachel's asking if we have any suggestions on where we might purchase seeds. So, there's lots of different places that sell. I don't know, Andrea, do you have anything off the top of your mind for buying seeds?
Not off the top of my head for bulk purchases. It's generally pretty difficult to find bulk quantities. However, if you're looking for a relatively small amount, there is Prairie Moon Nursery. We've ordered plants from them before. They specifically focus in native plants. They're really great to work with and have a huge variety. And they don't just have ramps, they have tons of other woodland medicinals. So that would probably be worth checking out. There was, Karen, what was the seed producer? She was producing flats of live plants.
Yeah, that was Red Root Native Nursery. So I just threw the link for Prairie Moon into the chat, and I'm going to go ahead and just throw
Red Root Native Nursery.
Yeah,
that's who it was.
Yeah, I'll throw that in the chat as well. So there are options.
Yeah, I don't know of any other producers off the top of my head.
Yeah. Well, all right. Well, let's see another question here. Best time of year to harvest seeds from a wild patch? Yes. So those seeds will mature around late August, early September, and that's probably the best time. The method that I've seen that works pretty well is you can literally take like a sandwich bag, and maybe you have another technique here, Andrea, and just put it over that seed head and crinkle it up, and those seeds should just fall right off. That's one way to know that they're ready to go. They're right into the bag, and move along. So yeah, a little time consuming, but pretty satisfying too.
And if most of the seeds on a seed head are ripe, but you notice a few that might look like they're not quite yet ripe, they'll continue to finish ripening in the bag once you've harvested them. So you can take the whole head. You don't have to leave the few on there that are green, unless you want to. You can do what you'd like, but they'll continue to ripen once you harvest them.
All right. Well, thanks again. We did record this, so we'll make that recording available to everybody that joined and folks that may have gotten confused with our technical errors at the beginning. We'll have this available. So thanks again for coming. Good luck in your ramp hunting this season, and hope to see you all again soon. So thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for your patience.